sort of at a distance what the working group has been doing. I'm not directly involved in agriculture, although I've often been an advisor to agricultural activities in the Pacific Islands and elsewhere. But being a marine biologist is more the marine aquaculture side of things that is the area that I've studied more closely. So I thought it would be interesting for the group to look at agriculture in the larger perspective of all the challenges of sustainability we're facing and the ways which it's contributing or can help to resolve some of the problems that we're facing. So that will be the core of the presentation. So I'll start sharing my screen now, and we can go through that, and then be time for questions afterwards. So if we look at sustainable development, the concept which goes back a few decades now, it was defined by the World Commission on Sustainable Environment Development back in 1987 as meeting development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So it's really looking to the long-term future and not raping in the short term without any regard for what may happen to the planet afterwards. But it also has two key concepts, looking at the essential needs of the world's poor. So there's an element of justice that is also involved in this concept, that we should not be leaving anybody poor in a world with adequate resources. And also the limitations imposed by the state of our technology and social organization. So, and that's where I think we have to look, in terms of a Baha'i perspective, what might we be able to free up some limitations in terms of better social organization and a better set of values in the future, which may mean that we can expand the carrying capacity of the planet at some future time. Of course, the latest definition of sustainable development is the Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted in 2015 at the United Nations by all the countries of the world. And a number of they're all integrated, they should all be different, but a number are quite related to agriculture, whether it be eliminating poverty, zero hunger, and therefore providing food for everyone, maintaining good health, clean water, life below water and on land, addressing the climate issue, reducing inequalities, lots of different things that in one way or another do or relate to things that happen with the environment or agriculture, and that we need to look at when we're considering how do we see agriculture evolving to meet the needs in the world ahead. At the same time, sustainability is not the same for everyone. It's very dependent on the context you're in, whether it be in time or in space, whether you're rich or poor, young or old. We have very different directions towards sustainability between wealthy countries and poor countries, where in the wealthy West, we're over-consuming resources and need to lighten up and release resources for those who have much less. Poor countries have often had to destroy their environment simply to survive and had their wealth extracted for the benefit of the wealthy countries. And therefore, they may need more development where we may need less development. And therefore, it's a question of convergence from many different perspectives to achieve some kind of sustainability. It's also not some fixed point we can drop and say, oh, wonderful, we're sustainable today. It's a question of dynamic balance to be maintained over time, not some goal that we can reach. And therefore, it's how do we keep our balance if what is pushing us off balance? And it's often the things that are unsustainable. Oh, this is something that is throwing us off balance. How do we reduce that in order to achieve something closer to sustainability? But it also has to stay within planetary boundaries. We've grown to the point where we've hit the boundaries of the planet. We no longer have new frontiers to move to. And therefore, and scientists have defined the major boundaries of the planet. I've listed the 9 here. And many of them are related to agriculture in one way or another. And the ones in red are ones where we're at or overshooting the boundaries. If you sort of map them, you can sort of say, well, climate change are already in a danger zone in terms of genetic diversity, the biological richness of the planet. We're well into the red zone with high risks and major destruction coming ahead. Land use change, we're we're not doing well at all and could easily begin to be exhausting resources. I'll come back to that a little later. Freshwater is another area we're not doing badly, but a lot of it is distribution. And one of the interesting things is nitrogen and phosphorus, which are two of the chemicals most essential to agriculture, where we're already very much in the red zone. If you look at the nitrogen cycle of the planet, there was no, artificial fixation of nitrogen before Industrial Revolution. Scientists have defined the boundary as 62 million tons of, fixed nitrogen applied to land per year. We're at 150, more than twice that, and it's rising steadily. So that more than half of the fixed nitrogen on the whole planet comes from human activities, either fertilizers or burning fossil fuels. And when you have too much nitrogen, you get eutrophication in water supplies, where they get fertilized, ecological imbalances, and releasing CO2 from plants. So it's taking us in the wrong direction. Phosphorus is equally bad. There was very little pre-industrial use. The boundary was 6.2 million tons per year applied. We're already at twice that, 14 and rising. But the exploitable reserves, the mines of phosphate for fertilizers, are only expected to last another century and a half or 2 or 3 centuries at the most. So this is not a renewable resource that we can count on in the long term. And therefore, while we can manage in the short term, we have to be attention where we're going when we want to look at agriculture in the future. So if we stand back and look at a systems view of agriculture, obviously adequate nutrition, having enough food, should be a basic human right. Everybody, ensuring everybody has enough food should be a moral responsibility for all of us. Being able to eat is part of being human. Yet nearly 1 billion people still go hungry in the world with adequate food for all. And in fact, the number has been increasing rapidly with the pandemic. The agricultural system is also very complex. It has environmental, social, economic dimensions that we have to look at all together. It's not, we can't sort of break it up into little silos and look at one part and not another. They include the problems of our whole human population, which is what we're trying to feed, how we use the land, what happens to biodiversity, our water supplies, how we manage food itself, impacts of climate change, the economy, both in terms of supply from agriculture and the demand for agricultural products. All of these are dimensions that need to be integrated when we consider what kind of system we want or need to evolve to. So if we start looking at the human population, we've been growing rapidly for several decades, and therefore we've had to increase food production, and starting with the Green Revolution in the 1970s and today's highly intensive industrial agriculture. And yes, for the moment it's been producing enough food, but at what cost? At the same time, we look at the population, we'll also see many of the wealthy countries have aging populations. We're running out of young people. We maybe have shrinking populations in some wealthier countries. So, and birth rates decline, and more and more people move to the cities. When they move to the cities, they tend to have fewer children. So the remaining rapid population creation now is linked to poverty and the lack of education, which is something we need to address as another problem. We shouldn't really allow it. And of course, we need to therefore increase food production in the short term to meet the increasing demand in the few decades ahead, because that population is built into the age structure of the population. But then we may need to adapt to a stable or shrinking demand later in the century. In fact, the world population has tripled in my own lifetime, and it's expected to rise to maybe up to 10 billion people by 2050. So we're following for the moment the classic ecological pattern of overshoot and collapse, where population grows and eats more and more of its food supply until finally it's eaten up all the food, and then it dies off, which just happens with flower beetles and other kinds of insects with other population controls. And the carrying capacity of the planet depends on our numbers, how many people we are, and our standard of living. The higher standard of living, the less space there is, because more resources we're consuming. If we want to fit more people on the planet, we need to live a simpler life and consume less. Looking at population growth scenarios, there's a lot of debate now, because for a long time, people were looking at the high projection, the top of the curve, with the population going up to 10, 12, 14 billion people by 2100. But with the rapid decline of birth rates as urbanization is taking place, they're now beginning to think maybe we will peak by 2040, 2050 and see a stable or declining population afterwards. There's still a lot of debate as to what may happen, assuming, of course, some disaster does not wipe out much of the world's population. Other problems with people, of course, is how we eat. Alongside the hungry poor, the billion who can't get enough to eat, we also have people whose high-fat, high-sugar foods and sedentary lifestyles makes them unhealthily fat. So over 400 million people are obese, 2.5 billion people overweight. That's 1/3 of adults, and it's been increasing rapidly since 1980. Even in the developing world, nearly 1 billion people are obese, more than in developing countries. America is the fattest country in the world from that point of view. And of course, at the same time, 1/3 of all the food produced is wasted somewhere along the value chain, whether it be crops that are thrown out that can't get to market, or they're too ugly to go on a supermarket shelf, or people take it home and don't get around to cooking it, or you feed it to your children and leave half of the food on their place. All the way along the line, we waste a lot of food, and a lot could be done to be more efficient, certainly by eating the food that we produce effectively. The other crises that we're facing with respect to agriculture, one is the coming soil crisis. Many past civilizations collapsed because they degraded their soil. I mean, look at the land around the Mediterranean basin, where you had the great Roman civilization and Carthage in North Africa. Soil erosion has carried the soil away, and you see these rocky hillsides with a few struggling olive trees and so on, because they couldn't maintain their food production. In Indiana, for example, for every ton of grain harvested, a ton of soil is lost each year to wind and water erosion. So there's been, you have a thick lowest deposit for the moment, but you're losing a lot of soil, and sooner or later it's going to be gone. Since 1949, the end of World War II, erosion has degraded 1.2 billion hectares. That's equal to the surface area of China and India. 38% of all the global cropland has been seriously degraded by erosion. And we have to abandon 12 million hectares every year, 1% of the total. In addition, intensive agriculture degrades the organic matter and microbes in the soil, and therefore reduces its fertility even before it is carried away. So we cannot keep going with an agricultural system that is destroying the very foundation on which it is based. If we look at soil grids all around the world, major areas are being affected by producing very degraded soils and limiting our future. This, of course, means we're also apt to be facing a coming food crisis. Intensive agriculture requires expensive energy, fertilizer, and petrochemical inputs. World cereal production peaked in the 1980s and has been decreasing slowly since in terms of per capita food. Of course, feeding a growing world population, reducing hunger will require a doubling world food production by 2050. But we already reached planetary food shortages in 2008, 2012, 2 years when there were major crop failures in America and in Russia and other places around the world with rising prices. So we're already close to the limit between the number of people who need food and the ability to produce it. United Nations recommends moving to community agriculture, but the multinational agribusiness system is too powerful to make the change. I'll come back to that later in my presentation. One of the results has been this global land grab in the last few years. Wealthy governments and large companies buying up large areas of land in poor countries for export to ensure their own food security. In 2008, 10 million hectares were bought, and 20 million hectares in the first half of 2009 equal now to all the arable land in Europe, from South Korea, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, in Sudan, Saudi Arabia, and Tanzania. Daewoo, the Korean company, 1.3 million hectares in Madagascar. South African business about 8 million hectares in the Congo. China, 2.5 million hectares in Congo, 2 million in Zambia, with 1 million Chinese farm laborers in Africa to farm their land, not even using Africans. And of course, this means that as the population grows, we change more and more land use in order to turn it for agriculture or urbanization or other uses. And there's only so much that we can continue to convert. As we destroy natural landscapes and ecosystems for human use, we degrade the land and reduce the ecosystem services that that land produces. Looking just at forest conversion to croplands, it was estimated we should save 70% of the forest areas if we want to maintain our atmosphere, soil, water supplies, and so on, and biomes intact. We're already down to 60% and it's shrinking rapidly. So we've gone well beyond the boundary there for the risks that come from land use change. This, of course, takes us on diversity of things living on the land and the integrity of the biosphere itself, the layer of life in the water, land, and atmosphere at the surface of our planet. Nature provides all sorts of services to us in terms of food, fiber, fuel, but it also provides essential services that we don't see so much, like regulating our climate and the water cycle, improving air quality, protecting us from floods, and so on. Agriculture itself also depends on biodiversity for everything from pollination and pest control to genetic resilience. Heavy use of pesticides has caused a massive reduction in insect populations, including those essential to pollinate crops. If we look at some of the figures, the extinction rate before modern industrial impact was about 0.1 or 1 species per million species per year. Scientists estimate that if we go beyond 10 species, million species per year, we're actually going to have problems. We're actually now at 1,000 species a year being extinguished. And with global warming of 2 degrees, we could lose 20% of all the species on the planet. If we warm to 4 degrees, which is possible in the century, we could lose half the species on the planet. The annual cost of forest loss is $2 to $5 trillion per year. In Europe, they've estimated we've lost 80% of the insect biomass, the total quantity of insects in Europe. It used to be you drive around and get those splattered things on your windscreen, your windshield. Now you hardly see anymore. Soon there'll be no natural ecosystems left, requiring our human intervention to maintain some biological diversity. So this is another catastrophe that's coming on us very rapidly. Freshwater, of course, is another resource essential to agriculture. Most freshwater use from streams and groundwater is used for agriculture. And water use for crops will have to double by 2050 if we want to have the number of hungry. But already by 2025, in 5 years, 1.8 billion people will live in regions with absolute water scarcity. And 2/3 of the world population could be subject to water stress as climate change reduces rainfall in these areas. So while we've not reached a boundary of 4,000 cubic kilometers of water per year, we're actually at more than half that, 2,600. So we're already coming close to, once the water is not distributed everywhere where it's needed, we're already facing a crisis in many places. If we look at how precipitation is expected to change with climate change, on the lower right, we can see major areas that turn brown as the precipitation decreases by up to 50%, and much more precipitation in the polar areas, for example, where you may get, where we're getting a lot of warming, and if we get running off as water rather than even snow and ice forming. Whereas climate change is another thing that is an immediate threat to agriculture. It's already happening in many places because it's transforming the planet, including for agriculture. Farmers can no longer assume that future growing conditions will be the same as in the past. And increasing variability, which is one of the things that happens with climate change, can easily cause crop failures. So adapting agriculture to a changing climate is an enormous challenge. Agriculture is also a major cause of climate change, emitting greenhouse gases, whether from deforestation and land clearing, where all the carbon in the trees and vegetation and soils is released to the atmosphere, or methane emissions from cattle, sheep, or rice paddies. Methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. Or the carbon released by the breakdown of soil organic matter. And of course, the use of fossil fuels for agricultural machinery and food transport. All of these things are one of the major contributors. I think up to 10–15% of global warming is caused by agriculture. If we look at what's happening with climate change already, there's a major warming taking place in the last 50 years, and it's clearly continuing. And of course, carbon dioxide, the most important greenhouse gas, is a major thing where crops, plants absorb CO2 to make the food, and then animals release it. When we eat it, release it as well. And the CO2 concentration in pre-industrial times was 280 parts per million. The boundary to avoid catastrophic warming, 350 parts per million, were actually over 450. I just saw yesterday, we're up to 417 parts per million, in the month of May this year, in spite of the pandemic. This is the highest it's been in at least 2 million years. So what the models are telling us about what's going to happen to the climate, the map on the upper right is one of the most likely scenarios for the end of the 21st century, with warming of 5, 7, 9, 11 degrees. I mean, already this past summer, there was a village in Siberia north of the Arctic Circle that reached more than 20 degrees Celsius. That's steaming hot. But north of the Arctic Circle is unbelievable. And the projections that we can see on the charts on the left of where we will go, in the red zone, 4, 6, 8, 10 degrees of warming by 2300. If we allow this to continue, and yet trying to keep the blue line in the bottom and stabilizing in 2050 will require fundamental changes in every part of our society and how we use energy. So it's going to be an enormous challenge to try to do that. Of course, some people say, well, biofuels will be our solution. We can grow crops, turn them into fuel, and use it to replace fossil fuels. But the present biofuel crops require high energy inputs to grow, harvest, and process them. The maize ethanol system either has zero net benefit or 12%. Soy biodiesel is 41%, but there's still very little. So biofuels compete with food production, raising food prices, particularly for the poor. And there's a pressure to clear tropical forests for oil palm and soybeans. So it's destructive in that way. And even if we converted all American land to produce biofuels, it would only meet 5% of Americans' fuel needs, so it's not sufficient. The economic dimension of agriculture is also critically important. The modern industrialized farming and livestock raising are driven by multinational agro-industries to maximize their profits. They develop patented varieties of their crops to control their genetic resources, often privatizing innovations which are created by farmers or indigenous peoples. They select varieties that depend on fertilizers and biocides that they manufacture. So farmers have to depend on their packaged solutions, buying the seeds, the fertilizers, the pesticides, in order to get things to grow properly. Now they're using big data to control all the information on the food production system with satellites and drones and so on, so they can tell farmers what to do and when to do it, integrating along the whole chain from farmer to consumer so they can capture all the profits for themselves. In Canada, they're keeping farmers on the verge of bankruptcy and total dependence, and they lobby for laws to protect their economic model and prevent competition from other approaches to agriculture. I met a farmer in France a couple of years ago at a meeting looking at sustainability in rural areas. Among all the farmers in his area, he's the only one who makes a reasonable living. He has an organic farm, processing all the products himself, distributing them locally in the local markets and so on. Everything he does is illegal, according to French and European regulations put in place by the agro-industries. In the United States, farm cash receipts have increased over the past century from $6 billion in 1910 to $336 billion in 2018. But production expenses rose just as fast, from $4 billion to $359 billion in 2008, with no appreciable growth in the value of net farm income over the last century, which shows how much the system has been captured by industrial interests. Even if we want to try to restore the earth, one estimate is that would cost us $100 billion a year to protect crop soil, to reforest the forest areas, stabilize water tables, restore rangelands, restore fisheries, protect biological diversity. So the food system, of course, is distorted by this whole focus on materialism, on material wealth and consumption. In fact, the Universal House of Justice in One Common Faith warned us that the earliest 20th century materialistic interpretation of reality has become the dominant world faith in the direction of society. This dogmatic materialism has captured all significant centers of power and information at the global level, ensuring that no competing voices can challenge projects of worldwide economic exploitation. And the Western food system reflects this process. And of course, that depends on us, the consumers. This vision of human progress produces our consumer culture. It's ephemeral goals. For the small minority who can afford them, the benefits are immediate. We like hamburgers and so on and so forth. It's easy and quick to grab and fast foods. But of course, the breakdown of traditional morality has led to the triumph of animal impulses and hedonism. This is all meeting immediate impulses and needs. Selfishness has become a prized commercial resource. Falsehood reinvents itself as public information, as we see more and more today with false news. Greed, lust, indolence, pride, and violence are broadly accepted and have social and economic value. And the highly processed foods of the industrial system, heavily marketed, are behind many of today's health problems. The food is not even good for us. And of course, all of these things are taking us towards crises. We're already in the midst of a pandemic. And many of these, affect food production and trade in our globally integrated system. Other crises could be a conflict in major powers or nuclear exchange, an economic collapse as the global debt bubble bursts, accelerating climate catastrophe, even a giant solar flare. I don't know if how many of you know that there was one in 1859, that because the only thing there was a few telegraph wires sent electric shocks to all the telegraph operators. If it happened today, and nobody knows how often that could happen, it could destroy everything electrical on the planet. Suddenly, no cell phone, no computer, no internet, no electricity. What would that do to our material civilization, of which we're totally dependent? And of course, this is nothing new. Already back in 1972, in the famous Lindsay's Growth Report from the Club of Rome, they computer modeled what would happen to civilization over the 2 centuries, from 1900 to 2100. On the left, we see business as usual, as it was modeled. And basically, you can't see the deep fine print, but we do quite well to tell about 2020 or 2030, and then civilization collapses as pollution rises and food production collapses, industrial collapses, and so on, and we head for disaster. These, of course, are system one. They then updated the study for the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, and they found that if we began to move to sustainability then, we could stabilize the planetary system with enough food per person and a reasonable life expectancy, bringing down pollution. But they said if we waited to make the transition until 2015, of course we're now already in 2020, we wouldn't be able to avoid some significant collapse in civilization in mid-century. And even if we rebounded after that with our efforts at sustainability, the quality of life, the goods per person, much less than would have been had we made the change earlier. Now, these were scenarios. They were computer projections. What did we actually do? Scientists went back to look at these studies in 2012, and we've tracked right on schedule. They were doing slightly better on birth and death rates, but all the other things were following exactly as predicted by the computers. The only thing that is no longer possible is a scenario of stabilization. It no longer seems possible to avoid some kind of a crisis or catastrophe in the years immediately ahead. So we also think, what are we going to do to help us live through the crisis that may be coming? In such a case, survival may depend on the ability of local communities to feed themselves through solidarity, collaboration, and innovation. Then suddenly, the Baha'i approach to community building is seen in a new light. It could be one way of increasing our local resilience in the face of an uncertain short-term future, as we lay the foundation for the ever-advancing civilization to emerge later on from the trials and difficulties we're facing. So we really must change to sustainability as quickly as we possibly can. And of course, this paradigm of sustainability is very different from our present economic system. Keeping things in balance, looking for the optimal size, not growing forever. Subsidiarity, bringing decision-making down to the level closest to where the things need to be decided and where the problems are, increasing our efficiency, dematerializing, using fewer and fewer materials to achieve our standard of living, and closing our economic and agricultural system as much as possible so we don't just throw things away, but recycle them again, take care of all the raw materials on which we depend. Of course, has always done this. As mentioned at the beginning, my specialty is coral reefs. If we look at a coral reef ecosystem and how sustainable it is over millions of years, it captures solar energy efficiency, and any materials in the water captured by plankton are grabbed and pulled into the system. By the large surface area it generates itself. It's very efficient at energy transfers within the system, with many symbioses, ants and plants and animals working together, helping each other, being much more efficient than each one separately. Corals have algae living inside. Imagine green cows in your pasture with algae inside their skin, producing their own food, not needing to graze. We don't have on land the efficiency already in the sea. There's little waste, effective recycling of any materials that may be released. It's highly complex and integrated, many thousands of species working together, and they maximize total productivity. Even the most inefficient little addition is something more to the system, not just the one most productive crop or animal or whatever. It's a different approach to creating benefit for all, using everybody's capacity and not just the few most productive. So of course, and the Baha'i community has told us decades ago, sustainability is fundamentally an ethical concept. As trustees or stewards of the planet's resources and biodiversity, we must ensure sustainability and equity of resource use into the distant future. And of course, the Baha'i vision, civilization for 500,000 years. We must consider the environmental consequences of development activities. Temper our actions with moderation and humility, not words you hear often in the mouths of economists or politicians. We must value nature in more than economic terms and understand that the natural world and its role in humanity's collective development is both material and spiritual. So the Baha'i community continues, sustainable environmental management must come to be seen not as a discretionary commitment mankind can weigh against other competing interests, but rather as a fundamental responsibility that must be shouldered, a prerequisite for spiritual development as well as the individual's physical survival. So we need this not just for our bodies, but also for our souls. Baha'u'llah, of course, talked about that principle of moderation, the golden mean, and the foundation of sustainability, when he said, the civilization so often vaunted for the learned exponents of arts and sciences will, if allowed to overleap the bounds of moderation, bring great evil upon men. He told us to be content with little and freed from all inordinate desire, and to take from this world only to the measure of our needs and forego that which exceedeth them. So if we use more moderately the agricultural potential available, there'll be more to go around to share with everybody else. Sustainability, of course, also requires better organization at the global level. And the World Order Baha'u'llah, as described by Shoghi Effendi, includes a world legislature, which will ultimately control the entire resources of all the component nations, and will enact such laws as shall be required to regulate the life, satisfy the needs, and adjust the relationships of all races and peoples. The economic resources of the world will be organized. Its sources of raw materials, including agriculture, will be tapped and fully utilized. Its markets will be coordinated and developed. The distribution of its products will be equitably regulated so that everybody can benefit and not just a wealthy few. We also have values for the economic system. To be sustainable, it must aim to be a dynamic, just, and thriving social order, strongly altruistic and cooperative in nature, providing meaningful employment for every human being, and helping to eradicate poverty in the world. So this is very different from the new level economy that we see in the West today. The House has also said, sustainable economic and social development of all countries is of vital importance. and agriculture and the preservation of the ecological balance of the world are of fundamental interest. So, with environmental limits is possible if we have the political will and we can make the changes in our values and our economy. But to maintain our ecological balance, we've got to base the economy on renewable energy and resources in agriculture, forests, fisheries, bioindustries. We should close material cycles and develop integrated product life cycles so nothing is wasted. We need to reduce our human impacts to a level appropriate to the vulnerability and resilience of the natural systems of the planet. We should restore damaged systems to the level necessary to maintain both natural and human ecosystem services. And therefore, we should allow population growth and development only to the extent that system improvements extend the carrying capacity of our planetary system. Of course, if we go to what Abdul Baha said about sustainability, he was one of the great early teachers of the principles that we need to achieve sustainability. About an environment, he said, all beings are connected together like a chain, and reciprocal help, assistance, and influence belong to the properties of things, are the causes of the existence, development, and growth of created beings. He talked about ecology when he said, the growth and development of the vegetable kingdom is impossible without the existence of the animal kingdom. And the maintenance of animal life is inconceivable without the cooperation of the vegetable kingdom. Of like kind, the relationships that exist among all created things. Hence, it was stated that cooperation and reciprocity are essential properties which are inherent in the unified system of the world of existence, and without which the entire creation will be reduced to nothingness. At Stanford University, where I studied many years ago, he said, the elements and organisms and lower organisms are synchronized in the great plan of life. Shall man, infinitely above them in degree, be antagonistic and a destroyer of that perfection? A question we need to answer with sustainability. He talked about the respect for our creation. Briefly, it is not only their fellow human beings that the beloved of God must treat with mercy and compassion. Rather, must they show forth the utmost loving kindness to every living creature. With respect to agriculture, he said the fundamental basis of community is agriculture, tillage of the soil. All must be producers. He then went on to explain the economic principles related to that. Each person in the community whose need is equal to his individual producing capacity shall be exempt from taxation. But if his income is greater than his needs, he must pay a tax until adjustment is effected. That is to say, man's capacity for production and his needs will be equalized and reconciled through taxation. If his production exceeds, he will pay a tax. If his necessities exceed his production, he shall receive an amount sufficient to equalize or adjust. Therefore, taxation will be proportionate to capacity and production, and there will be no poor in the community. This is so important when you look at agriculture, where you can have good years and bad years. If there's a year where the climate is bad or insects or crop failure, under this system, you would receive from the community what you needed to meet your needs. Could go on being a farm the next year. You wouldn't be driven off the land, forced to migrate or whatever, move to a city. This would immediately help take care of the natural variability in agriculture. So looking briefly as we come to the end at agriculture systems for the future. Clearly, agriculture needs to move from soil destruction to soil restoration. If we change, and that's what we learn with permaculture and so on, we're learning how to rebuild and strengthen the soils rather than destroying them. Agriculture must become a responsible partner in managing the increasingly scarce water resources essential for life. Agriculture can address climate change by transforming to reduce emissions, by restoring natural vegetation to areas no longer needed for farming, by making more space for nature in agriculture, as with agroforestry and so on, and by increasing soil humus for carbon capture and storage. New forms of agriculture can help to restore functioning natural systems, including organic farming, permaculture, agroforestry, and others yet to be developed. There's a lot to be in innovation still to come. We have the example of Abdu'l-Baha's wonderful village in the Jordan Valley, which is described so well by Pushy and by Hanley, where he demonstrated how community could innovate to establish sustainable agriculture. So we have a practical example where he bought some land, he brought some Iranian farmers to cultivate it, showed them how to do it, helped find new crops for them, so innovated. It's a wonderful example to look at in more detail. So how do we make rural life both attractive and rewarding for those people who stay there? With new information technologies, we can reduce isolation, provide access to knowledge and culture. Nobody wants to stay locked up, without all the things they know are happening in the world, but this is now possible even in rural areas. Food prices need to be set to ensure an adequate income for the farmers and not grabbed all by middlemen or agro-industries, complemented by the kind of income guarantee that Abdu'l-Baha described. We also say, what about the size? What is the optimal size for a community in a rural area? Look at the local Baha'i institutions, the Mashriq al-Azkar, local spiritual assembly, 19-day feast. They seem to be designed for small communities, such as those appropriate to rural areas, not necessarily for mega cities of millions and millions of people. Renewable energies are more distributed, therefore more accessible to rural areas. We're looking at wind or solar, geothermal and so on. So agriculture needs to be adapted to each local environment. It's not all the same everywhere. Each geographic location, each social situation. Communities need their own scientific research capacity to develop and manage the best agriculture for the local resources and coming changes. So it's not just a few experts off in some remote laboratory, but building that capacity into local communities. Each community also needs to find the balance between local self-sufficiency and integration with the global economy. We know commerce will continue in the future, so what balance do we strike between what we can produce locally and what we can need if we have changes in seasons, we can produce in one season, we can import in the off season and so on. There's a balance still found between the two. Agriculture is thus one essential component of the global human and natural system that is struggling to emerge from a world of competing nation states to become an ever-advancing world civilization. But agriculture is only part of the system. Change is also needed in the larger economic system and corporate structure, in the operation of markets and trade relationships, in taxation and wealth redistribution, and mechanisms to support and integrate rural communities. So agricultural reform needs to be part of broader systems change. We can't do everything at the local level. The Baha'i community has told us the pathway to sustainability will be one of empowerment, collaboration, and continual processes of questioning, learning, and action in all regions of the world. As the sweeping tides of consumerism, unfettered consumption, extreme poverty, and marginalization recede, they will reveal the human capacities for justice, reciprocity, and happiness. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm open to questions or discussion. And I've left at the end of the presentation suggested readings, and my presentation is available if you want it from the organizers. So I'm very happy to be able to share these ideas with the working group. Thank you very much.